Some names in Morrowind sound like someone at Bethesda slipped and fell on their keyboard.
It just works.
But how in Oblivion are we actually supposed to pronounce these? Are they just generic fantasy words where everyone makes up their own pronunciation as they go? Or is there more to it? Do the games hide secret, forbidden knowledge that allows us to pronounce these cursed words? Some of them are spoken out loud in the games. And since I'm a scientist at heart, and technically also on my diploma, let's run a small experiment. The null hypothesis is simple. These names are pronounced more or less the way an English speaker would naturally read unfamiliar fantasy words. No hidden system, no special rules, just your run-of-the-mill fake fantasy word pronunciation.
Alusaba. Takio? Takio. Taco? How do you pronounce this?
The alternative hypothesis is the official pronunciations show systematic features that do not sound like default English. That could mean someone at Bethesda gave the voice actors something like a pronunciation guide. Something like, this is what Ashlander words are supposed to sound like. Use this kind of accent. If the lights begin to flicker, the walls start bleeding, and the Daedra appears in the booth demanding residuals, then you know you're doing it right.
I smell weakness.
So here's the method. For each name, we will compare three things. First, the baseline pronunciation. So how one would read the name assuming it's kind of English. Second, I will reconstruct a more sophisticated one based on the various real-world inspiration and references. I spent way too much time researching all of these. And third, the actual official pronunciation from the game. If the official version sounds close to the baseline, that is evidence for the null hypothesis, so it's probably just fantasy English. If it differs in a consistent, non-English sounding way, so different stress patterns, consonants handled in an unexpected way, or sounds that are hard to produce for the average English vocal cord, that is evidence for the alternative hypothesis, and there really is a secret special way of saying these words. And if one side scores significantly higher than the other, we have our evidence-based answer. To make the baseline a little less contaminated, I recorded myself saying these names a few days ago. Hey, it's me from a few days ago. Before looking into the lore, the real-world inspirations, or the official pronunciations. Now, yes, I'm aware that using myself, a non-native English speaker, as the baseline for generic English pronunciation is not exactly laboratory-grade methodology. But I got a hunch like a lame corpus that the results will be clear enough either way. So with the protocol established, let's begin. But before we continue, this video is sponsored by Gainer Capital, the only wealth-building program in Mournhold powered entirely by confidence, escalating commitment, and one Bosmer's statistically impossible luck.
Hello there, friend. Are you tired of carrying around useless idle gold? What if I told you that with just 5 simple payments, you could unlock the path to true financial independence? For only 50 gold, you enter the bronze luck tier. But serious investors know that real growth requires real commitment. That's why the silver luck tier is only 100 gold. From there, our proprietary temple courtyard accumulation strategy scales naturally to 1000 gold, then 10,000 gold, and finally, 1 million gold!
That's right, 1 million gold, because with Gainer Capital, your gains are not theoretical, they are emotionally insisted upon.
I gave Gainer 50 gold, and 2 days later, he was wearing full ebony armor. That's what I call growth.
Other investment firms talk about risk. At Gainer Capital, risk is something that happens to other people. Usually people who refuse to pay.
Use code NERAVARINE today and receive a free consultation, a complimentary threat assessment, and absolutely no written guarantee of anything.
Wealth beyond measure.
Gainer Capital is not registered with the East Empire Company, the Tribunal Temple, House Lalu, House Redder, and House Telvanni, your mom's house, the Imperial Treasury, or any institution capable of basic oversight. Initial payment of 50 gold may be followed by additional required payments of 100 gold, 1000 gold, 10,000 gold, and/or 1 million gold. Payment schedule may escalate without notice, reason, documentation, mercy, or mathematical coherence. Returns are not guaranteed, implied, estimated, modeled, backtested, prophesized, blessed, or real. Refusal to pay may be interpreted as mockery. Attempting to pay the full amount may also be interpreted as mockery. Missed payments may result in Gainer returning within approximately 2 days in ebony armor and attempting to break your bones through a combination of luck, resentment, and poor consumer protection law. By participating, you waive all rights to refunds, explanations, intake kneecaps, and peaceful temple courtyard access. This is not financial advice. Apart from Dwemer Ruins, which I've covered in a previous video, the worst offenders for my tongue will break in half if I try to say that word are probably the Ashlander camps and Daedric ruins. If you've only ever played Oblivion, Skyrim, and Oblivion again, then you've been spared one of Morrowind's great pleasures, fighting your way through Daedra-infested rectangular hallways, finally reaching the reward at the end, and then immediately being attacked by yet another Daedra that apparently materialized out of pure spite. Daedric ruins are massive religious structures dedicated to the worship of the Daedric princes. Architecturally, they're hard to miss. Dark stone, strange markings, unsettling patterns, awkward angles, and those crooked oval doors that look like they were designed by someone who had heard of symmetry and then decided to have none of that. The Dunmer call this style responsible architecture, and according to the lore, it was taught to them by Boethia sometime in the First Era. Personally, I would argue that putting jagged edges and decorative spikes at eye level is the exact opposite of responsible. But I'm not a Daedric prince or an architect, so what do I know? Michael Kirkbride once summed up the design philosophy in one of his concept art notes. The architecture doesn't have to make sense, it just has to evoke. He then followed that note with, actually, this all sucks, redraw, Matt. Which, to be clear, wasn't him being passive-aggressive toward his colleagues. That was just him looking at his own sketch, deciding it wasn't working, and asking Matthew Carafano to take another pass at it. But in a way, I agree. Daedric ruins do suck. Not because they're a badly designed part of the game, they're iconic, but because every time I sent my character into one, I imagined them thinking, this sucks. Why are we here? Why would I even want this piece of bread that's been lying around in a dank, Daedra-infested ruin for who knows how long? And no place has more of these cheerful little death temples than Morrowind.
They're tied closely to the history of my people for good or ill. The mountains of the Ashlands are rife with old Daedric ruins. Some are not as forgotten as we might like.
Daedra can often be found wandering the grounds, both outside the ruins and deep within them, although some of these places are also occupied by outlaws, cultists, or anyone else with a suspiciously relaxed attitude toward demonic architecture. Most shrines contain a statue dedicated to a Daedric prince, usually surrounded by offerings. And if you decide to steal those offerings, the game may respond by summoning a Daedra to punish you for your poor theological etiquette. And the names of these Daedric ruins, much like their occupants, are to die for. Or, more accurately, to die by.
Daedric ruins are never deserted. Stay away if you know what's good for you.
These shrines are far too ancient to have been named by the Dunmeri cultures we encounter in the games. If anything, their names probably don't come from the Dunmer at all, but from the Chimer, the ancient ancestors of the Dunmer, before they became the Dark Elves.
Do they teach nothing these days? Long ago, we were the Chimer, with light skin and fair eyes. We worshipped the good Daedra. To mark the ascent of the three, we were gifted with this more sober complexion, and the realm of Morrowind forever.
The Chimer spoke Old Chimeris, sometimes referred to as Velothi.
Chimer, Dunmer, Velothi, Ashlander. This one is confused.
And how did the different Ashlander tribes get their names? Thanks to ESO, we actually know the answer. In the quest Ancestral Ties, we learned that the tribes were named after their founders, the first Ashkans of the 4 great Ashlander tribes. So let me try to butcher these names real quick. Naylor Ahamusa, Shaidar Arabanimson, Lamak Urshilaku, Akami Zainab. ESO presents them as ancient Velothi ancestors, the founding fathers of the Ashlander tribes, who united the Velothi people against Scar, the gigantic emperor crab. In case you didn't know, the huge structure in the center of Aldrune was once a giant living crab, and after its death, the Velothi thought to themselves, hey, it's free real estate.
The annual pilgrimage to honor the fall of Scar, the great emperor crab. The Ashlanders claimed their ancestors united to bring the beast down.
And while this is never stated outright, Scar seems to have been slain before Azura's curse transformed the Chimer into the Dunmer we know today. Either way, whether they were still Chimer at the time or already cursed to become Dunmer, they probably would have spoken Alt Chimeris, not modern-day Dunmeris. Now we know that both the Daedric ruins and the Ashlander tribes were likely named by cultures speaking something like Alt Chimeris or Velothi, the precursor to the modern Dunmer language. Which raises the obvious question, do we ever actually hear Alt Chimeris spoken in-game? Or does the canon give us any guide to how these words are supposed to be pronounced? Something like that book, How to Pronounce Drama Words, which I covered in another video. And spoilers, that book turned out to be a joke. Super useless, very much an inconvenience. But with Alt Chimeris, the games don't even give us that. There's no direct pronunciation guide, no confirmed fluent Alt Chimeris speaker, and no voice line where someone helpfully says, hey, I'm speaking Alt Chimeris, Here is the authentic ancient Velothi pronunciation, please take notes. Which makes sense, all this happened a very long time ago, roughly around the period of the Battle of Red Mountain, placing us in the First Era, about 3,500 years before the events of Morrowind. And yes, there are people from that era who are still alive, because the Elder Scrolls universe is crazy like that. But even then, I'd assume that anyone living for thousands of years would adapt to the changes in local language and pronunciation over time. So even if we had a voice line from someone that old, it still wouldn't necessarily tell us how Old Chimeris was pronounced back then. But we can still make one important assumption. It was probably different from modern Dunmeris. Why? Because of the Ashlanders. Canon strongly supports the idea that the Ashlanders preserve a more traditional Velothi branch of Dunmer culture. Both the Great Houses and the Ashlanders descend from the Old Chimer, or Velothi people. But the Great Houses became settled, political, tribunal-dominated societies, while the Ashlanders preserved a nomadic tribal culture centered on ancestors, Daedra, wise women, Ashcons, and oral prophecy.
The Dunmer houses bow to the tribunal, but the savage Ashlanders refused to acknowledge their divinity. The heretics never allowed themselves to be assimilated into the great houses. Instead, they hold to primitive superstitions.
They are not a perfect snapshot of ancient Chimer culture, of course, but they are probably the closest surviving link to that older Velothi religious and tribal world.
We follow the ways of the Chimer, not the false gods of the tribunal.
So it seems pretty clear that Morrowind contains at least two different linguistic strains. On one side, you have the more mainstream Dunmeri names. Names of people, places, and settlements like you can see here. And then you have Ashlander names, which immediately feel like they belong to a different layer of the world. Those two groups just do not feel like they should be pronounced the same way. It would be wrong for the Ashlanders to say these names using plain old English pronunciation rules, right? And the Skywind team agrees. I really like their interpretation of the Ashlander language, or dialect, because it treats it as something distinct, something older, and something that does not just sound like standard fantasy English with extra apostrophes.
So basically, Skywind is using a recreation of Dunmeris, the Dark Elf language. So in these more rural areas that don't intersect with the Empire, you're going to get a lot more indigenous language. Our voice actors worked really hard to bring it to life, as well as our writing department. So it really feels like you are out, away from the Empire.
We have concrete evidence that Ashlanders do not simply speak regular Dunmeris, the common Dark Elf language we encounter across most of Morrowind. And for that, we can thank our good friend Yakum I'm not ready to pronounce that name yet. Yakum used to live a traditional, nomadic Ashlander life as a herder. But life on the steppes has become increasingly difficult. Constant ash storms are killing the grass, spreading the blight among animals, and making the old nomadic way of life almost impossible to maintain. So Yakum eventually abandons the Ashlands and settles in Pelagiad, where he takes a steady job and tries to adapt to the lifestyle of the settled Dunmer. But one thing he still struggles with is the language. He has trouble speaking the language of the settled Dunmer, which he calls Old Elf, and he prefers his native Ashland dialect. Or, as he puts it,
"Hello, Yakum. Speak Ashland. Old Elf, not so good speak."
So the game directly tells us that Yakum speaks Ashland, and that his command of Old Elf is limited. At the very least, Ashlander speech is distinct enough from settled Dunmeris that someone raised in one can have serious difficulty communicating in the other. And we get another relevant line in the Elder Scrolls Online, when we ask Huntmaster Sorim Nakar about a deadly Nyx hound.
We call it Tara Suj, which means powerful hunter in my people's language.
It would be a very strange thing to say if his people simply spoke the same language as everyone else. Unfortunately, in Morrowind itself, Ashlanders have the exact same voice and pronunciation as every other Dunmer. But that is almost certainly a production limitation, not a hidden lore statement from Bethesda telling us that every Dark Elf, across every region and culture, speaks in the same voice with the same accent. If the games and canon lore won't tell us how to pronounce these words, we have one last place to look: the real world. The Elder Scrolls games were not created in a vacuum. Like any fantasy world, they draw on plenty of outside inspirations. And if you know anything about ancient Mesopotamian, Assyrian, Akkadian, or Babylonian names, you probably noticed something already. A lot of Ashlander terms and many Daedric Ruin names seem heavily inspired by that linguistic world. Sometimes they may not even be inspired so much as just straight up copied. Take names like Ashurnabibi, Ashurdirapal, and Ashurnabitashpi. The first element immediately recalls Ashur or Assur, both the name of an Assyrian god and one of the great cities of Assyria. Or compare Ashurdirapal, Zergonipal, and Ashurbanipal. Except one of those is not a Daedric ruin at all. Ashurbanipal was a real Neo-Assyrian king. Then there are names like Ashurdan, Foyada Ashurdan, and Ashirdan, which clearly resemble the name of Assyrian kings called Ashurdan. Arabanimson may echo names like Eriba Marduk, a king of Babylon, and the element Ache seen in names like Asha Ache, Ashu Ache, Dun Ache, and Tin Ache strongly resemble the ending in royal names like Ashur Nadin Ache and Marduk Nadin Ache. The same goes for Namu and Numu, which appear in names like Namu, Manamu, Punamu, Sinamu, and Zanamu, very likely echoing names such as Ur-Namu. So overall, Bethesda seems to have used a Semitic and Mesopotamian sounding layer for ancient Vardenfell. Ashlanders, Daedric shrines, tombs, and remote ruins all draw from that same sound world. Of course, we don't have actual recordings of ancient Akkadian or Babylonian speakers, but we do have scholars reading reconstructed versions of these languages. The SOAS library at the University of London has recordings of Assyriologists reading from the Epic of Gilgamesh. I'll use some of those clips later to help reconstruct possible pronunciations for the Ashlander words. And if the fact that you're watching this video right now is not proof enough that you, dear viewer, much like myself, should probably get a life, then oh boy do I have a movie recommendation for you. The Poor Man of Nippur, the world's first film in Babylonian. Yes, that exists. The link is in the description. Close your eyes, and with a little imagination, you can almost pretend you're sitting in an Ashlander camp.
Anabelika, takdaktilani kiam kibashu. Ashu ishtet pilte shatemidane, shanu aribakuma. Rihat ishtet.
As a side note, the timeline even lines up surprisingly well. These ancient Mesopotamian languages were very much alive around the same broad period, roughly 3,500 years ago, which is also around the point in the in-game timeline where we assume many of these ancient Ashlander and Daedric names would have originated. We're now going to look at 21 words that seem to belong to this Ashlander linguistic tradition, and importantly, words that are actually spoken in the games. But before we hear the official voice lines, let's try to predict how they should be pronounced based on the real-world influences we found. First, the names of the Ashlander tribes themselves. The four main ones we come across on Vardenfell. Ahemusa. The first part Ahe could be ancient Akkadian Ahe, which would be more like Ache, Ake. Granted, it's just one H here, so maybe not. Then I found the words, or rather segments, Maha and Amus in the readings of the Assyriologists I mentioned earlier.
Maha, Amus.
And if we take the Acha and turn it into Ache and Amush into Emusha, we would get Achemusha. Could also be similar to the Egyptian Amose, a pharaoh and founder of the 18th dynasty of Egypt. I found pronunciations ranging from Achmose to Yamos, which would give us either Achemusa, so basically what we had before, or something like Yamosa. Arabanimsum. I found the at least somewhat similar building blocks Eriba, Minim, and Sin. And if we splice that together, we get So it might be something like Erabenimsun. Urshilaku. The in the beginning could be a reference to an ancient Sumerian city-state called Ur, like in Pur, Tur. And if we look for fitting fragments, we get the Ur in Uruk, Shi, and Laku from Ilakushi. And if we again just splice them together, we get
Urshilaku.
So like Urshilaku. Zainab. This one could just be Zainab. an Arabic female name. And I also found the word Zaina.
Zaina.
So maybe it's something like Zainab. Then there are other Ashlander tribes located on the mainland of Morrowind, such as this one, Kagash. There is actually Kadesh, an ancient city in what is now Syria, which would give us something like Kagash. But I also found these pronunciations for the word Kadesh.
Qadish.
So maybe it's more like Kagish. Mabrigash. No clear reference for this one. Maybe the Gash from the Kassite Bugash, for example in Nazi Bugash, another Babylonian king. So my suggestion would be something like Mabrigash. Next up we have some more confirmed Ashlander vocabulary, like these two. Ashkhan. Gula Khan. Khan is a historic title originating among nomadic tribes in the central and eastern Eurasian steppe, and means something like king, with different pronunciations like Khan, Khan, Ken, which would, for example, give us something like Ash Khan and Gula Khan. Foyada. I couldn't find any clear reference or inspiration for this one in the Mesopotamian or Babylonian languages. In-game, Foyadas are ravines formed by lava flowing from Red Mountain. For the longest time, I assumed this was an actual geological term, but as it turns out, real lava would usually solidify and fill the ravine, rather than carve out these riverbed-like structures we see in Morrowind. My personal theory is that the word was inspired by Norwegian fjords, narrow sea inlets carved by glaciers. Replace the glacier with lava, change a few letters, and you end up with a foyada. So maybe we could pronounce it similar to a fjord, like fjada. Namu. Remember Ur? One king of the city of Ur was called Ur-Nammu.
Ur-Nammu.
Which gives us a very clear example for how to pronounce the word Namu. And last but not least, the Daedric shrines themselves. Ashal-Mawiyah. This one could be inspired by Mavia, an Arab queen in what is now modern-day Syria.
Mavia?
So similarly, it could be Ashal-Mavia. Asarnatamat. The first part, Asar, could be similar to Ashur, as mentioned earlier, which was one of the capitals of the Assyrian Empire, and also the name of a god, and Amat was used in many Babylonian female names. And with these three fragments,
Umashal,
Shunatan, Tiamat,
we could build something like
Mashal,
Natamat.
So like Ashar na Tamat, Ashur na Bitashbi. Definitely the Ashur from earlier. And the ending Tashbi just sounds like it could be from the same language family, but I couldn't find any clear examples. So we have to improvise at the end and could get something like Ashurna Bitashbi. Dushariran. Dushara was a pre-Islamic Arabian Nabatean god.
Dushara.
Which would give us something like Dushariran. Abernanet. Ebernari is an Akkadian administrative or geographic term used in Assyrian and Babylonian records for the lands west of the Euphrates. It means beyond or across the river. So if we just change the ending slightly, we get Ebernanit. Asutanimus. Apart from the Namu from earlier, I couldn't find anything similar. Of course, it's just one M here, so maybe there's more stress on the A. So like Esutanamus. Kaushtarari. It has some resemblance to Kashtaritu, who was a Median chieftain. He is mentioned as King of the Medes. Kind of rings a bell, right? Medes sounds almost like the Needs. Anyway, it could give us something like Kaushtarari. Mal-Kashishi. It could be inspired by Malik, which means king in several Semitic languages, like here in Arabic.
Malik.
And Kash was part of Kashtiliash, for example, a Babylonian king, so maybe Mael-Kashishi. Shashpilamet. Shamash was the ancient Mesopotamian sun god, and we covered Amat before, so maybe something like Shashpilamat. Vasir Didanet. The first part, Vazir, visually resembles Vizier, a Near Eastern administrative title transmitted through Arabic, Persian, and Turkish usage. Didanet may vaguely resemble Dedan, an ancient Arabian oasis kingdom name cluster. So maybe Vizier Didanat. Zain Teraris. The beginning could again resemble Zainab, an Arabic female name. Other than that, no clue. So maybe it's something like Zain Teraris. Now, to be absolutely clear, every pronunciation I just gave you is hypothetical. If you're an astrologist, a historic linguist, or anyone who actually knows these languages, I apologize for whatever crimes I've just committed against your field. Although, realistically, if you made it this far, you've probably already torn your ears off. So I suppose you won't hear this apology anyway. And now for the grand finale. Let's compare three things. The naive English pronunciation, my own reconstruction based on the real-world inspirations, and the actual in-game voice lines. If the in-game voice line sounds basically like the default English reading, the null hypothesis gets a point. If it sounds closer to the real-world inspired reconstruction, or at least clearly not like plain English, the alternative hypothesis gets a point. In case you forgot, the null hypothesis is there is nothing fancy about the pronunciation of these words. And the alternative hypothesis is someone somewhere at Bethesda thought of a special system or accent or dialect or whatever, so basically there's a correct way to pronounce them, and it's not just plain old English pronunciation. Is this scientific? No. Does it prove anything? Also no. But it's my idea of a good time, so let's begin. And by the way, all the voice lines we have come from ESO. All except one, which is from the OG Morrowind, of course. See if you can spot it. None of the other games were brave enough to pronounce these Ashlander words out loud. So, credit where it's due. Props to ESO for actually committing.
This land drank the blood of Ahemusa heroes.
Ahemusha. Yamosa.
Ahemusa.
Ahemusa? Now, listening back, I realized that my naive English pronunciation sounds a little bit strange in its own right. But regardless, the ESO version is clearly much closer to a plain English reading. So that's 1 point for the null hypothesis.
What business do you have with the Arabanimson?
Erabenimsun.
Arabanimson.
Arabenimson. Definitely another point for null.
You walk among the Urshilaku Outlander.
Urshilaku.
Urshilaku.
Urshilaku. +1 for the null hypothesis.
You walk among the Zainab as a child walks among hungers.
Zainab. Zainab.
Zainab.
Zainab. The ESO pronunciation is not exactly exotic, but I would still give this one to the alternative hypothesis. It sounds different enough from the plain English reading to count. If you disagree, feel free to leave a very angry comment. I'll read it, take it personally, and cry myself to sleep tonight.
I'm the wise woman of the Kargish tribe of Ashlanders.
Kagash. Kargish.
Kargish.
Kagash. A pattern is starting to emerge. Whenever the spelling allows it, Elder Scrolls Online tends to pronounce A as a broad ah sound, closer to how I would say it in my native language. So I'd give another point to the alternative hypothesis.
What's your step among the Mabrigash, outsider?
Mabrigash.
Mabrigash.
Mabrigash. Another point for they just pronounce it like you'd pronounce any fantasy word.
Muck sponge? The Ashcan likes grilled muck sponge.
Seek the Ashlander, Ashcans, and the great house councillors.
Ashcan.
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 Ashcan. Null hypothesis strikes again.
The Gula Khan doesn't want you here, and neither do I.
Gula Khan.
Gula Khan.
Gula Khan. The null hypothesis has quite the lead already.
What's going on at Foyada Quarry?
Fyada.
Foyada.
Foyada. I'd say that was a default pronunciation as well, so another point for null.
You could see Xanamu.
Namu.
Namu.
Namu. By the way, Namu is a very common building block in Ashlander words. I'm only using Xanamu here as one example. But in this case, the default English pronunciation and the pronunciation suggested by the real-world references are basically the same, so I don't think either hypothesis gets a point here.
Powerful Daedra have been sighted roaming the wilds near the sunken vaults of Ashalmawia.
Ashalmavia.
Ashalmawia.
Ashalmawia. This is another case of the A versus R pattern, so I'm giving this one to the alternative hypothesis. And if you think that still sounds like plain English pronunciation, listen to this example.
I am the only thing keeping Baal's minions confined to Al-Shamawiyah.
Now, this was probably not intentional, but since the voice actress adds the extra L every single time, and since the alternative hypothesis could choose a few pity points, I'm going to let this one count.
Brigands desecrate the ancient shrine of Asanatamat.
Asharna Tamat.
Asanatamat.
Asarnatamat. This one is hard to call, but I think it falls well within the range of how most English speakers would naturally pronounce a made-up fantasy word. So that's 1 point for the null hypothesis.
The shrine of Ashurnabitashbi has become a haven for exiled Ashlanders who prey upon those who traverse the wastes.
Ashurnabitashbi.
Ashurnabitashbi.
Ashurnabitashbi. Again, the real-world reference and the default English pronunciation are too close to separate meaningfully, so I'd skip this one, no points either way.
Vampires nest within the ruins of Dusheriran.
Dushariran.
Dusheriran.
Dusheriran. Another point for the null hypothesis.
The shrine of Ebernanit, once lost, has emerged from beneath the ever-shifting ash.
Ebernanit.
Ebernanit.
Abernanit. When in doubt, I'm giving it to the alternative hypothesis, especially because it gives us yet another clear example of that ah sound.
It's called Esutanimus.
Esutanamus.
Esutanimus.
Esutanimus. Null.
Chodala and his most loyal followers have taken refuge in a ruin called Kaushtarari.
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 Kaushtarari. Again, null.
Do you know Mael Kashishi, a fallen shrine to the Lord of Madness?
Mael Kashishi.
Mael Kashishi.
Mael Kashishi. This one sounded pretty much the same to me, so I'd call it another toss-up. Let's skip it.
The thieves Muthsera Gothran mentioned fled to Shashpilamat.
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 Shashpilamat. Null hypothesis strikes again.
I need someone to investigate what's going on in the Vasya Didanat ebony mine.
Vasir Didanat.
Vasya Didanat.
Vasir Didanat. The A versus R thing again. Let's give it to the alternative hypothesis.
Ah, the one about Zaintiraris, is it?
Zaintiraris.
Zaintiraris.
Zaintiraris. Let's say null. Final score, 13 points for they just pronounce these like normal fantasy words, and 5 points for maybe there is something deeper going on here. And even if you disagree with how I scored some of these, I think the overall results are pretty clear. The in-game pronunciations are overwhelmingly unsurprising. Most of them sound plain, readable, and not especially guided by some hidden ancient Velothi phonology. Except maybe for one thing, the A versus A pattern. If you want to be a little more precise, it's about the difference between the two symbols you can see on screen now. This A versus A. And this one hits close to home for me, because German does not naturally have the English A sound as a normal native phoneme. So, like many German speakers, I tend to replace it with a more open A sound. And that is exactly what stood out in many of these voice lines. A lot of the Ashlander words were quite liberal with A in places where I would expect many English speakers to default more toward an A. I might also be reading too much into this. It might just be a completely normal difference in different accents and dialects. In any case, my main takeaway is this. Elder Scrolls Online did not have any major, detailed pronunciation system for Ashlander words. But if there was one loose pattern, it was this use of A whenever possible. Which, as an unintended side effect, makes some of these names sound slightly German. But were they wrong to do that? Can we accuse them of being lazy and demand strict pronunciation guidelines for every ancient ruin, Ashlander tribe and half-forgotten Velothi name? Honestly, I don't think so. Since Morrowind is so alien, it's easy to forget that these ruins were not named a few generations ago. They are ancient, even by the standards of a universe where some people casually live for thousands of years. If you visit an ancient Babylonian ruin today and ask a local person what it is called, they will not pronounce the name according to the most current academic reconstruction of old Babylonian phonology. They will pronounce it according to the rules of their own modern language. And the same logic applies to the Elder Scrolls. In universe, people may be speaking Dunmeris, for example, or any number of other languages, but because we, the players, do not speak those languages, Bethesda gives us the games in English, how kind of them. So when a Dunmer tells us the name of an ancient Daedric ruin, what we are hearing is essentially the English stand-in for modern Dunmeris. In that sense, using a mostly plain English pronunciation is actually defensible. A modern Dunmer probably would not preserve the exact ancient Chimer pronunciation of every ruin name either. They would say it in the modern form of their own language. So, as much as it pains me to admit it, Bethesda and ZeniMax Online Studios probably made the practical choice here. But there is one exception. The Ashlanders themselves. If the Ashlanders really preserve a distinct language or dialect, and if many of them are not fully comfortable with settled Dunmeris, then they should not sound exactly like every other Dunmer. For us, that means they should not sound like native English speakers. They should sound like they're speaking English as a second language and are really struggling with it. In other words, they should sound just like me. Is the exact opposite of responsive. I can't. Blah. Payment schedule may escalate without notice, reason, documentation, mercy, or mathematical. Blah. If you've only ever played Oblivion, Skyrim, or Oblivion again, then you've been spared one of more. Missed payments may result in Gaynor returning within approximately 2 days in ebony armor and that is evidence for the alternative hypothesis, and their